Hello, everyone. My name is Gerard Robinson. I'm the Vice President for Education at the Advanced Studies Culture Foundation located in beautiful Charlottesville, Virginia. And I have the honor today to have a conversation with three people who are going to talk about the future of school choice, the landscape, and what it looks like. This is a very important year in the history of school choice, and we'll learn more about that from each three of our speakers. But let's put in context why school choice matters in 2020 by taking a look to see how far we've come since the 1990s. Today, 26 states, the District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico support at least 55 private school choice programs across the country. Approximately 21 of those programs are focused on students with special needs. Over half of the 55 programs have a focus on students who also come from low-income families. So the whole idea that school choice, from its beginning, has been for wealthy people who wanted a way to simply escape the public school system to pay for a very expensive private school simply is not true. When we look back at 1990 and the city of Milwaukee, who in 1990-91 created the country's first urban-based voucher program through the support of Polly Williams, who was a state representative in that area, with support from Dr. Howard Fuller, former superintendent, but also from a Republican governor and a Republican legislature. They came together and said, we're going to do something radically different. We're going to give low-income families in Milwaukee an opportunity to have access to schools outside the public sector, to use public funds to pay for it, because these people also pay taxes to the system, and why not give them an opportunity to do so? Well, the program that started off again in 1990 again has mushroomed to today, where we have 575,000 students enrolled in our programs. And while that is impressive, think about the million plus who are on waiting lists to try to get into some of our programs because of the type of quality that was discussed in an earlier panel with Patrick Wolf, Mike McShane, and others. So what we're going to do is talk about this subject, and we're going to also do it from the level of politics, but also law, but also policy, and also advocacy. All three speakers can do that. And if they would, I'd also like to know why in particular they find this issue important. I was sharing with the panelists earlier that my first introduction to school choice in the private sector started in 1991 when I was a fifth grade school teacher at the Marcus Garvey School in Los Angeles. And met a guy named Kevin Teasley who was talking about the importance of getting parents in the South Central LA area to sign a petition to get a ballot initiative in California to give parents access to a voucher. Around that same time, I ended up learning about Jim Blue and about Clint Bolick. Although the legislation was soundly defeated, 70-30 by the voters in 1993 as it was in 2000, even though it didn't pass, the number of parents and others began to make a push. So for me, I've been involved in this long enough to see the good, the bad, the ugly. And while all of our programs aren't perfect, they have provided a major pathway to economic mobility, social mobility, and middle-class status for millions of families who have not had a chance to do so. So to see if people agree or disagree with that, we're going to start off first by introducing Tim Keller, who is a senior litigator at the Institute for Justice. The Institute for Justice, as well as some of the work he's doing, they have represented a number of families in school choice cases across the country, including one that was discussed this year from the state of Montana, and I'll hold off and let him talk more about that. So, Tim, glad to have you here, and also want to thank you for a very good chapter that you wrote in a book that I had a chance to support, talking about ESAs. We also have Luke Ragland. He is from Colorado, and he is with the Ready Education Network. It was created in 2015, and they work with a network of conservatives who want to make schools better and to support the idea of school choice. Before taking on this position, he worked as vice president for Colorado Succeeds, and so he's seen how this works at the state level, but also the need for conservatives to be at the table. We also have, last but surely not least, Ellen Weaver, who is the president of the Palmetto Promise in South Carolina. Her organization promises to use free market values to support parental choice in her state. Prior to this work, she spent time working on Capitol Hill for a U.S. Senator, and there was a great deal about public policy at the national level and how it should trickle down to the state level and to support some work. So with that, welcome to this conversation.
Thanks, Gerard.
Yeah, thanks.
So,
yeah, thanks, Gerard.
Tim, let's start off with you. You were involved with IJ and others in a very important case that is helping redefine what we think about the role of public money in private schools. Talk to us about Espinoza, and also feel free to talk to us about what attracted you to this line of work in the first place.
Sure. Well, I'll start with the second question. I was working for the Goldwater Institute in 1995 and 96, and at that time, the Goldwater Institute was pushing for educational reform in the Arizona state legislature, and it was important from sort of an academic perspective at first. Just the notion that parents should have the freedom to choose the school that's going to best work for their kid. It just seemed to make sense as good policy. And I remember we were pushing first for a voucher program in Arizona that failed, and we ended up with a charter school law. And the Goldwater Institute commissioned a survey of some of the new charter schools that had opened. And I remember visiting one of the brand new charter schools in Tucson, Arizona. It was established to serve students who had either dropped out or been kicked out of the public school system for a variety of means. And I remember that they were offering 3 different courses or basically sessions per day because they were trying to accommodate low-income students who had to have full-time jobs in order to help support their families. And talking to a student who either went, to students who went early in the morning or late in the evening, and it was just incredible that we had to pass this law in order to create opportunities for kids to just finish their high school education because of the demands that were put on them at such a young age. And just hearing their personal testimony and their stories really drove home the importance of this type of work. And then at the same time, IJ's co-founder, Clint Bullock, came out to Arizona and was a visiting fellow at the Goldwater Institute. And I learned that the teachers' unions were so opposed to school choice programs that as programs were passed, they were filing lawsuits to halt the programs, and that it was IJ that was stepping into the breach to defend those programs on behalf of parents and students. And so it was that confluence of events that led me to leave a path that I was on to get a PhD in economics to pursue a degree in law with the single sole focus goal of one day being an IJ attorney. And now here I am. And since that time, IJ's litigated three school choice cases in the U.S. Supreme Court, the most recent of those being Espinoza v. Montana Department of Revenue. And in that case, the U.S. Supreme Court had to answer the question, can a state rely on a provision of its state constitution to exclude religious options for families, even though the state legislature had originally created a program that would serve all students? So basically what happened in that case is the legislature in Montana adopted what we would call a scholarship tax credit program, a program that incentivizes private individuals to donate to private scholarship organizations and give those scholarships to families to attend the school of their choice. The Montana Department of Revenue believed that a provision of the state constitution, which we would commonly refer to as a Blaine Amendment, these are provisions that were originally motivated by anti-Catholic animus. They typically say something to the effect of there should be no public funds used in aid of sectarian schools. And the Department of Revenue looked at that provision and said, well, under that provision, we cannot allow scholarship organizations to give scholarships to families who want to use that to send their kids to religious schools. And they passed a rule forbidding the scholarship organizations from doing that. IJ challenged that rule in court. The Montana Supreme Court ultimately upheld the restriction on religious uses of those dollars at religious schools. And so we had to take it up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And in Espinoza this past June, the U.S. Supreme Court said it violates the free exercise clause of the First Amendment to exclude religious schools from an otherwise neutral school choice programs. And they said that if a state is going to adopt a school choice program, it cannot exclude religious schools just because they're religious. So that decision really changes the landscape from a legislative perspective in 2020 and 2021, because no longer can state legislators or policymakers point to a state constitutional provision and say, well, this provision doesn't allow us to adopt a school choice program because we can't fund religious schools We now know that relying on state constitutions to discriminate against religion is unconstitutional.
Thank you. You mentioned 3 cases. What are the other 2?
Yeah, so in 2002, we litigated Zellman v. Simmons Harris. This was a case involving Ohio's school voucher program. And in that case, the U.S. Supreme Court held that it does not violate the Establishment Clause of the U.S. Constitution if a state wants to include religious schools in a school choice program. So after that, the question was, well, what if a state wanted to exclude them or felt like they had to exclude them? Could they? That was Espinoza, which clearly answered that question in the negative. And the other case was involving Arizona's scholarship tax credit program. And there was the plaintiffs in that case challenged the program under the Establishment Clause under a really unique theory that's really not all that important, because ultimately what the U.S. Supreme Court said was that because tax credit programs are privately funded, they don't involve public funds, the plaintiffs in that case didn't have legal standing to even be in federal court to challenge that program. Because typically taxpayers don't have standing to bring challenges to programs in federal court. You got to bring those claims in state court. And so that was a very important victory for us in the tax credit context. And of course, that decision that tax credit programs are privately funded under the federal constitution is highly persuasive in state courts and allows us to bring very similar arguments in state courts as well. Thank you.
So Ellen, let's turn to your work. You spent time, you understand Capitol Hill. And so in 2020, we know multi-trillion-dollar initiative was passed by Congress. GEARS money was ultimately moved its way into the hands of states and governors who could use that money to support education. Your Promise initiative, you worked pretty closely with Governor McMaster and played a role in helping to create a voucher program using some of the GEARS money. Talk to us about the process of what it was like to get to the point of, hey, Governor, let's do this, to working through the process itself and then seeing things move to the next level.
Yeah, I'd love to. And like Tim, I'll kind of start with the how I got into this question. This is a personal passion of mine because I am a product of school choice. My parents were lower middle income. We struggled to pay the bills every month, but growing up, I saw my parents sacrifice personal luxuries for themselves, family vacations for us, in order to send us to a small private school where they thought we would get the education foundation that we needed. When that school closed when I was in 5th grade, my mom made the really tough decision to homeschool us. And that was a huge commitment of time and stress for her. But she homeschooled me until 10th grade when she realized that some of the core subject areas she just didn't really feel competent to teach. And so I ended up finishing my K-12 career at a wonderful public high school. And so, seeing how my own education journey evolved helps me to understand that one size doesn't fit all for any student, even at different points in their education journey. And that's why I'm so passionate about helping every kid in South Carolina have that same opportunity that I was given, that has led to so many other incredible opportunities now in my professional career. So we've had a roller coaster ride here in South Carolina. There's an old saying that a historian once said that South Carolina is too small to be a country and too large to be an insane asylum. And unfortunately, we've lived up to that. Reputation this year. It's been a roller coaster ride. So safe grants, safe access to flexible education grants were born out of a response to the outcry of need from low income and working families here and parents who were just struggling to deal with their children's special need in the COVID-19 context. They saw their children falling further and further behind during the spring, and they were desperate for more flexible options. And so Governor McMaster has been a longtime champion of education choice. And as you mentioned, I worked at the federal level for a long time. I'm no stranger to seeing federal money wasted. And so in talking with Governor McMaster's team, we were just pursuing the thought of how can we make sure that this money gets to who Congress intended it to support, which is the education of children. Which kind of speaks to a larger question of what is our definition of public education? Is it a system of buildings and buses, or is it actually making sure that children have the skills that they need to succeed in life? And thankfully, Governor McMaster embraces that latter definition, that more expansive and pluralistic definition of public education. And so Palmetto Promise was honored to collaborate with him to create this need-based one-time scholarship program that would have been $6,500 a student to attend a school of their choice. And there's a video that I dropped in the chat that participants can watch at their leisure that tells a little bit more about the program. But what I want to leave you with is just that there was an overwhelming response to it. In the first 2 weeks after the program was announced, we had 15,000 parents who had emailed us to say, how can I sign up for this program for my child? And unfortunately, that's not the end of the story. As Tim referenced, the public education lobby is powerful. And they, even despite the fact that this was one-time federal money, that was new money, it was nothing off of their bottom line, they moved to get a secret injunction to stop the program. And so we took that fight with Governor McMaster all the way to the South Carolina Supreme Court, where unfortunately the program is currently sitting. It was halted. The court ruled it unconstitutional. There were a lot of problems with the court's reasoning in the decision. They completely ignored the Zellman case that Tim referenced. And I feel funny actually giving legal analysis in front of Tim Keller. I don't even play a lawyer on TV, but I'm just going to do a poor person synopsis here. Zellman found that it's the student that benefits from the voucher, not the institution that the voucher ultimately ends up at. The school is just a vendor that's delivering an education service. And unfortunately, our Supreme Court just completely bypassed that. They also ignored existing voucher programs in South Carolina. We have private vouchers in higher education, as well as in the pre-K space. K-12 is the only education sector in South Carolina that does not currently have a state-funded voucher. And it was also riddled with factual errors just about the nature of GEAR funds, to the point that the U.S. Department of Justice has actually filed a motion along with the governor for a rehearing of the case. And so that's where we currently are. We're in limbo, waiting to hear whether or not the Supreme Court will rehear this case and correct many of the factual and legal errors that they made in rendering their decision. There is a potential path forward for the program. We'll just see what happens. Theoretically, it could run through a nonprofit potentially, but we just have to wait and see what the court does and take it from there.
First of all, thank you for sharing your personal story. That speaks just to the power of who you are and where you are today through choice. For the 15,000 families, could you tell us a little bit about them? Are they from just one segment of South Carolina? Is it statewide? Where'd they come from?
Gosh, it was every nook and cranny of South Carolina. I mean, having worked in a Senate office, I thought I had been to every corner of this state, but there were little towns that we heard from. I had to look up on a map where they were, which I think just speaks to the universal yearning of parents to do the best that they can for their children. It doesn't matter where they are, what their race is, what their income is. They know that education is the path to promise. And they want that for their child. We had over 550 parents who responded when we put out a call for stories. And I can share those maybe later on in the panel if you like, just a couple of the ones that were really touching. But that to me has been the most incredible part of this journey, is just the chance to interact with parents and to see their tenacity and their commitment to getting their child what they need no matter what. Thank you.
So Luke, let's turn to you. Your network, again, is working with conservatives. Previous job, you worked also to make sure the business community was at the table. We often overlook the fact that businesses have a lot to say about accountability and credibility. Talk to us about what your organization is doing right now to support opportunities in Colorado, what do Coloradans want in particular, And how has the pandemic provided either an opportunity for some innovation or possibly even slowed down some of the things that were taking place beforehand?
Yeah, thanks, Gerard. So I think, just setting the table stakes where I'm coming from, I have a sort of all of the above sort of point of view on school choice. And the fundamental motivator for me is this idea that no one school can be the best school for every kid, right? Even the best school, in whatever way you want to define that, might be a terrible school for any individual child. And so that idea that no one school can be the best school for every kid really motivates me. And that means that we have to keep as many options open as possible in reflection of the diversity of needs among our children. I think the best example of this, it's always fun for people to think about or talk to others about, is if you have more than one child yourself. I have two girls, or you ask anybody who has more than one kid, ask them if they learn the same way, if they learn the exact same things. And they'll invariably say no. I'll give speeches and I'll ask that question. People get like a laugh line because it's so obvious that, well, no, of course those kids need different things. But think about that for a second. Those are kids that are living in the same house. Obviously, demographically speaking, we're controlling for every possible factor. And even then, parents will say they need different things. So that's the motivator for me. And looking at Colorado, I think it's definitely a state, a light blue state, but it's a state that's hungry for school choice. If you look at our charter sector, we have the second highest percentage of kids in charter schools of any state in the country. We have one of the most robust, or perhaps maybe the most robust, open enrollment choice system, which allows parents to choose between traditional district schools that are inside their neighborhood or even outside their district. They can choose those schools as a matter of right, as long as there's space in the school for them. So you put it all together, conservative numbers would say at least 30% of kids in Colorado schools, maybe upwards of 40 or plus, over 40% of kids are in a school of choice already in Colorado. So we have a critical mass, and I think that reflects the hunger that you see. And those numbers honestly don't even reflect post-pandemic. I think that you're going to see those numbers actually even increase coming out of the pandemic. All that's to say, I bring that up because I don't think that Colorado's parents' thirst for choice has been quenched by those options. And again, coming out of the pandemic, I think you're going to see even more hunger for these sorts of flexible programs. And for us, looking forward, what do we want to do next? It's flexibility is the name of the game. I think it's obviously almost a tired trope to say, parents are interacting differently with their child's education and resources. But it's tired. You hear it so much because it's, I think, certainly true. And so what does that mean for us in Colorado? I think there's sort of two premises that we're building off of coming out of this pandemic. One is there's a near universal understanding that kids have fallen behind during the pandemic, and that we're going to need to do something supplemental to catch them up. Just simply getting back to school, which is great. I've been a big advocate for reopening schools, but even just doing that's not going to be enough. I think we actually have to do something above and beyond what we've done traditionally for school. So that's the first premise, is that supplemental help will be necessary. But then number two is that we're going to need to do something different for each kid. Early data coming back shows that kids are in wildly different places, not only in terms of geography and where school closures have impacted certain areas more than others, where coronavirus has impacted communities more than others, but also even just different subjects. You're seeing early data that looks like kids might be particularly troubled in math coming back out of the pandemic. And so what that means, so again, the premise that we're working off of is that kids are going to need a lot of different types of things, and it's going to be incredibly varied. So we need supplemental, and we need something that's flexible and responsive to the unique needs. And that's what we're focusing on, is programs that can do that. And so we've got a bipartisan coalition working on an effort to recognizing those two premises to create a COVID relief package that's creating parent-directed learning accounts. And I'm happy to talk more about this, but I'll sketch it out quickly. Parent-directed learning accounts for supplemental learning in the wake of the pandemic. All providers, public and private, would be eligible. This means school districts, charter schools, private schools, individual tutors. Think about companies that run therapies for special needs children, foreign language tutoring, SAT, ACT prep, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This sort of project is a little bit different, a little bit new, but I would argue sort of fits right in that sort of spirit of parental choice and flexibility. I also think that this is addressing a trend that we're seeing, something predating COVID. If you look at affluent families and where they're spending money, which to me is actually maybe one of the most important indicators to look about where we can get the best bang for our buck, is where people are spending their own bucks when they have the ability to do so. they're spending more and more money on these out of school and supplemental learning tools, tutors, etc. And of course, those are only accessible to families who can afford to pay for those additional services. So I think there's a strong market indicator too that these are places that we should be looking. So there's a lot more to talk about with this effort, but I think that's a good place to start. I'll leave it there as a peg about how we're thinking from a sort of first principles perspective around school choice, how we're trying to deal with this moving forward post-pandemic.
You mentioned that your state is light blue and that you also have a pretty large charter school sector. I know a number of families in your state who also have kids in private schools. Is there a public-private kumbaya saying, yes, we want to support choice? Or is it mostly, we support charter schools, therefore private schools don't matter? Or is it something in the middle?
I'd say it's something in the middle. I mean, part of what I'm pushing is that we have that kumbaya. You know, I'm such a big believer in the idea that choice advocates should get back to those first principles like I described, and share the idea that the choice is what matters. It's not really what type of school. But of course, Gerard, I think you're hitting on an important point. A lot of people in the choice community kind of have their lane, right? And they get a little bit of tunnel vision when it comes to that. And I think that we'd be smart to join together, work closely to think about parents actually taking a choice, making an active decision is the key point, not necessarily what type of school they choose.
Thank you. So Tim, let's go to you. Big victory with Espinoza. We all threw confetti. All the people who weren't in court cheered. The philanthropists were excited. Our advocates were excited. And you, the lawyers, now realize, yeah, now the real work begins. Talk to us about what are the next steps from the work that you do to support states in trying to move this to the next level.
So much to discuss here, Gerard. So as folks may know, this current U.S. Supreme Court is an incrementalist court. The Roberts Court likes to answer the question that is in front of them in as narrow a fashion as possible. And so the Espinoza decision was very broad in one respect and very narrow in another. And that narrowness means we're probably headed back to the U.S. Supreme Court very, very soon to answer an unresolved question. So the broad aspect was that the court said states cannot discriminate against religious schools just because they're religious schools, period, end of story. That ruling applies nationwide. It's not limited to Montana. Every state is subject to that decision. But the court left open the possibility that states could regulate programs with regard to the religious use of funds. And it didn't really say exactly what that meant, but it got that window from a case that was decided shortly after the Zellman case that I mentioned, after the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the the Cleveland School Voucher Program in Ohio, and said religious schools could participate. A case reached the court out of the state of Washington, and the state of Washington operated a post-secondary scholarship program that gave students a scholarship to attend the private college of their choice, religious or non-religious. But the state refused to fund one very narrow category of instruction. They said that if a student was receiving a scholarship and wanted to use that to pursue a degree in what the court called devotional theology, basically a degree that would lead to vocational ministry, paid ministry, that you couldn't use the scholarship for that one thing. And the U.S. Supreme Court was widely expected to say that was unconstitutional, but in fact, they did not. So in the case of Locke v. Davey, the court said, number one, the Washington program is very friendly to religion. Students can use their scholarship at religious schools. They can use it to pay for religious and devotional classes. The only thing they can't do is use it to pursue this one type of degree. And the court in Locke said that Mr. Davey, the student in that case who was not allowed to use his scholarship for the purpose for which he wanted, was not being discriminated on based on who he was, but on what he wanted to do with the funds. And so in Espinoza, we had hoped to get a decision that the court would say, in the context of a scholarship program where families are choosing where and how to use those dollars, you can't exclude religious schools for any reason or impose any limitations. And the court said, we don't have to decide that today because Montana is only discriminating against schools based on their status as religious schools. This is a wholesale exclusion. And so if there are other restrictions in the future based on use, we can deal with those when they arise. And so we figured it would be several years before some state legislature passed a school choice program and maybe included a provision that said, you can't use the money to pay for religious worship or for religious classes or something, and that there would be a fight about that. But right after the U.S. Supreme Court issued its decision in Espinoza, we had a separate case pending in Maine. And Maine operates what we call a town tuitioning program. And under a town tuitioning program, towns that don't operate their own public schools, that are too small to support their own public schools, instead just give all of the families there a tuition voucher to use at the school of their choice. So families can attend a public school or a private school, except in Maine, you can't use that tuition benefit at a religious school. And IJ had a lawsuit pending, challenged the exclusion of religious schools from the town tuitioning program at the time Espinoza was decided. And of course, we all thought that this meant we were going to win. But the First Circuit Court of Appeals in that case said, no, this is in fact not status discrimination. This is use-based discrimination because the families who use their tuition benefit at religious schools, those schools are going to use them for religion. It's an incredibly broad reading of what might exist for the status use distinction, and ignores just about everything the court said that would likely apply in a situation where the state was actually discriminating based on use rather than based on status. For one thing, the court said almost assuredly they'll apply the highest standard of scrutiny, strict scrutiny, to such restrictions. The First Circuit applied what's called rational basis review, which is the lowest form of judicial scrutiny. And so early next year, we will be filing a cert petition asking the U.S. Supreme Court to finally resolve and hopefully just eliminate this supposed status use distinction, recognize that it was a bad idea in Locke, and it's a bad idea now. As Justice Gorsuch wrote in his concurrence opinion in Espinoza and in another case called Trinity Lutheran, it doesn't matter whether a family is using it, is a Lutheran family or is using it to do Lutheran things. The free exercise clause protects the exercise of religion.
Sure.
And it's this supposed distinction just utterly collapses in real life and in real practice and needs to be done away with and eliminated. So one thing we'll be doing is heading back to the U.S. Supreme Court there. Okay. But of course, every state constitution contains other types of provisions that sometimes have nothing to do with religion, and opponents of educational choice are going to continue to attack programs in state courts. We're currently defending programs against non-religious challenges in Tennessee and in North Carolina. We're watching for a potential case in Ohio. So anytime a school choice program is being considered, looked at legislatively, it's just incredibly important to involve the Institute for Justice or the lawyers at EdChoice, and make sure that the programs are being fully vetted, so that they're defensible against not just religion clause type claims, but other forms of state constitutional attacks as well.
I'm married to a law professor who also practiced law, and the way you guys split the word so finely is amazing. And I'm glad we have lawyers because someone has to do it. But some of us who aren't lawyers sit back and say, can't we just give the kids an education? Well, it depends on use. But glad that IJ is doing the great work. And I think of Leslie Heiner when you said EdChoice. So, Ellen, let's go back to South Carolina. And some of the things that Tim just said, you alluded to earlier in terms of state court and the politics of reading statutes, interpretation of rules and regulations. Your state currently has 2 tax credit programs focused on students who have special needs. Talk to us about that, and then let us know post-pandemic, well, not post-pandemic, but now that we're still in the pandemic, has the interest or maybe some of the pushback against a program like that softened as a result of the pandemic? Or are people still digging in saying, no, we don't want it because it's taking money from public education, or it's advancing religion, or something else? Still can't hear you. Is it just me?
I can't hear her either.
Okay. All right. Yep, still can't hear you. All right, we will wait for you. So someone from the team, the tech team, will come in and support you. We'll do a quick pivot to you. So Luke, you talked about Colorado and what's taking place in the public sector. Your state also was, home to a very successful charter program, but also a voucher program that was at the local level that was repealed. And I remember some of the debates that were taking place. I was working for a nonprofit at the time. What are some of the main challenges to the program, like vouchers in a blue state like yours? You alluded to it already, but why a charter is doing well and, in that situation, the voucher program did not?
Yeah, it's a good question. And so I sort of think about this in two buckets: legal side, that's obviously super relevant here, and a policy or political side.
Yep.
And so on the legal side, Espinoza and Trinity Lutheran changed the game. Colorado, like you mentioned, Colorado had a local school district that was running one of our largest school districts was running a private school choice program, was struck down under the Blaine Amendment. I think I saw somebody in the participant list here, Ben DeGrow, who knows more about this than I will ever know. And hey, Ben, if you're there. And so that was those legal barriers that have hampered efforts in Colorado are now gone. And so I think the more relevant question, sort of thinking forward, is a political question. And I like the question of thinking about in a blue state and how do we work on these sorts of programs. I still think there's a lot of space for choice. And I shared earlier that my belief that there's a ton of desire for choice, but I think for choice advocates, it means we need to think outside the box. We need to focus on first principles. And again, that for me, it's parent agency over decisions for their child. And I'm a school choice advocate, and I'll admit, sometimes I get tunnel vision, right? I start thinking it's about a voucher or it's about charter schools. And I start thinking about these things in these columns that don't necessarily reflect how parents view the system as a whole. And as a school choice movement, I worry sometimes that we've gotten too focused on the supply side of the demand and supply that exists in school choice. So we think about the supply side. We think, how can we fund charter schools? How are we going to get some charter facilities? We think about how we're going to fund private schools. Now, those are important. I don't mean to say we should abandon those sorts of questions, but I think there's an additional demand side of this equation that's been overlooked. And in blue states, I think it presents an opportunity. What do I mean by demand side? I think things about that juice the demand side of the equation for school choice. Thinking about transportation. What if we made it to where every kid could easily get access to any school? And we said, no, we don't worry about the supply side. Again, we're not talking about what type of school they're going to choose, but we said every parent can make a choice or have the access to a transportation voucher that gets them to a school that they want. Thinking about these out of school learning, these direct cash payments, these sorts of things that juice the demand side, even counseling, or thinking about coaching for parents who want to engage in the school choice process but might not feel comfortable. I used to run a website called Colorado School Grades. It was like a sort of, here's info on your school, and parents are hungry for that, but some of them are a little bit nervous about making choices. And sometimes the easiest decision is just the default decision. And so, like I mentioned before, there's a lot of exciting initiatives we're working on related to COVID relief. But I think it's different than a voucher, Gerard, is what I would tell you. It's not a voucher, right? This program is something I'm super excited about. I think has a lot of opportunity. It's not a voucher, but I think that's okay, because I think it's a great way to promote the principles of choice, but just thinking about it in a sort of new and fresh way. I'd say there's a positive externality here too that I want to highlight for people, and that it helps build new cool. We're building a group that is not the normal sort of school choice folks, because we're tapping into things that are outside of the traditional school setting. So think about Boys and Girls Clubs and the massive network they have across the state. Think about 4-H. Think about Scouts. Think about tutoring companies and individual tutors, which are often teachers that do this part-time on their own. Community groups and even immigrant sort of focus groups have been interested in these sorts of programs. And add that to the fact that coming out of the pandemic, I think that progressive communities are actually going to be hit harder and impacted heavier by school closures. You've all seen, I think it was the SERPI research that showed that politics is actually the better predictor of school closures, not science. But I think that blue communities are going to be actually hit harder, more progressive communities hit harder by school closures in the pandemic. And so the desire for supplemental learning, for something that can step into and fill that gap that was created, I think is actually a really interesting opportunity that breaks down some of the left-right sort of ways that we've thought about this. The final thing I would note, and this is maybe just a hat tip to Tim and his team, is the Espinoza case and Trinity Lutheran cases are really key to this effort that we're talking about with supplemental learning. This idea that we're talking about only works if all providers, public and private, are eligible, right? If my belief is that every kid needs something different, we have to open up this massive marketplace for people to access. Well, if we just limit it to the public sort of column, we're really undercutting the entire idea. And so it's not just that, but those legal cases change the politics side of the equation for me as well, because it gives us an incredible backstop, not only to say that we should include all providers, I can make that policy case all day, but that we actually are legally required to include all providers in this sort of otherwise neutral program. So just kudos to you, Tim. And I think that's a good place where the intersection of the legal side really strikes on the political side for me as well.
And Luke, thanks so much for talking about supply and demand, because oftentimes we only pick one for different reasons. Let's go back to Ellen. You're with us?
I'm here. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. The two
Excellent.
programs.
Thanks for putting up with the tech difficulties.
No, that's all part of it. You're a leader. You know how this stuff works. You pivoted, and so we made it happen.
Glad to do it. Well, I think I remember the question. It was, what has changed going forward? And again, I love that Luke has brought up the demand side, because I think that is probably the most tectonic shift in all of this. I think COVID-19 has awakened the sleeping giant of parents who may not have been quite as dialed in before as they are now. And I think that many parents across all political stripe, across all income level, are recognizing that too often the system is about the system and not about the needs of their individual child. And I think the place I've seen this most dramatically is talking to some of my friends who are parents of a child with a special need. It's simply not possible to serve an IEP in front of an iPad for 6 hours. And yet this is where many of the children with special needs in our state are. And, my heart breaks to think that we are doing generational damage, losing ground amongst some of the most vulnerable populations that were behind before the pandemic started, and who may never have a chance to make up their education journey without this very highly customizable and flexible mindset that Luke is talking about. So, I think in South Carolina, like around the country, the biggest obstacle to that mindset, and I hate to get political about it, but it's just a well-organized union-backed machine that prioritizes money over children. And so, oftentimes in states, especially like South Carolina, where we have a lot of legislators that hail from rural areas, where oftentimes the school district is the largest employer in their community, the politics of it, just the pure politics of it, makes it very difficult for a lawmaker to step outside the traditional way of thinking about education and try something that's more pluralistic, more progressive, more flexible. But again, I go back to the power of demand and the power of parents. And I think that our duty now as education freedom advocates is to harness and channel the voice of parents, to equip parents to tell their stories, and to talk with their lawmakers, because I believe they are the only political force that is big enough to counter the very well-organized and well-mobilized forces that are going to be fighting any form of flexibility, and that, Tim knows better than anybody, will continue to do so, I think, as long as we're having education conversations. One of the things that I'm most excited about here in South Carolina, and I'll close on this, is that we are very blessed to have a passionate education choice advocate in U.S. Senator Tim Scott. His own personal story, which he calls From Cotton to Congress, talks about his grandfather, Artis Ware, who would sit at the dinner table or the breakfast table every morning reading the newspaper. And it wasn't until Tim was much older that he realized his grandfather couldn't read, but he wanted to set an example for his grandsons of how important it was to get a good education. And so we are in the process right now partnering with Senator Scott to launch the Artis Ware Center for Education Opportunity, which is going to be the brand that our education work lives under. Because, you know, a lot of times I'm a policy geek and I can get lost in the policy weeds and all the details, but ultimately we're fighting for kids. We're fighting for kids like Tim Scott to have a chance. And that's what this is all about. And so I think if we can amplify the voice of parents, we have a really incredible opportunity in this post-COVID environment to make huge change.
And Ellen, it's definitely okay to get political because we understand that education is about power. And so politics is definitely one lane that we walk. I've got some questions for you, but I'm going to turn to the audience. I've got a couple of questions already. And for those of you who are watching, make sure to go ahead and send in your question in the chat area. So here's one, and it's for all of you. How should we shift school funding models in order to meet the demands of choice? Ellen, since we just had you, let's start with you and then we'll do a round robin. Can you hear me, Ellen?
Yes, sorry about that. There was a little bit of a delay. Yes, student-centered funding. I'm so glad you brought this up. This is actually a project that we've been very thankful to have a chance to collaborate with ExcelinEd on. Their great scholar, Matthew Joseph, who works on a lot of funding issues. And this is one of my top policy priorities for this next year. If I had a wish list, a Christmas education policy wish list. But we have got to make funding much more student-centered, by which I mean actually tied to an individual student and their particular needs, whatever they might be, whether it's a special need, whether they are gifted and talented, whether they are from perhaps a rural area and need sparsity support to help them get transportation to an option that meets their needs. And so that's something that I think we're going to have a lot of conversation around here in South Carolina. We've got to stop just layering program upon program upon program, no matter how well-intentioned they are, which actually dilutes the power of our funding formula, and tie funding back to students and to their characteristics, and obviously make it so that the funding can travel with them. You know, that's the ultimate idea here behind all of school choice, is that, you know, if public education is a shared value, which I believe it is across the entire ideological spectrum. I've never met a Republican or a Democrat who didn't want to see kids educated. And so it's time that we tie the dollars that all of us are spending to its intended purpose, which is the education of the student.
Yeah, I like the idea of the student, of the money following the student. Often opponents of it will say, well, poor families or low-income families can't use it, and yet low-income families who qualify for federal benefits have debit cards that they use and travel many places to buy things. And also debt seems to travel and find people, but that's another story. Tim, let's kick it over to you.
Sure. Well, I'll say three things. Number one is that our good friend Corey DeAngelis over at the Reason Foundation, I think, has put this so succinctly so many times on Twitter. You know, we need to be funding students, not schools, or we need to be funding students, not systems. And that just encapsulates, I think, everything that Ellen said so nicely. One of my school choice clients put it another way. She said the dollars need to follow the scholar. And both of those, I just think, encapsulate the entire discussion around revamping and revitalizing the way we fund schools really nice and succinctly. But the last thing is, I know that when you actually sit down, Gerard, you're right that there are some student populations that have different needs and who actually may need more funding, and we need to consider what sort of funding weights need to be attached to certain types of students. Arizona has an education savings account program, and one of the categories of eligibility are students with special needs. In Arizona, students with special needs have different funding weights attached to them, and with Arizona's ESA program, those funding weights follow the students. So some of our students with some of the most the highest needs have some of the highest funding levels, which allows them to truly customize and obtain the goods and the services they need to get their kids a good education. So we do need to think about equity in the same time we're talking about having dollars follow the student, and how to best capture and ensure that the students have the resources they need to get a good education. So I think our friend Lisa Snell over at the Center for Student-Based Budgeting has been doing a lot of good work and thinking about how to put together an equitable funding formula that would still have the students be at the center of that funding system, and making sure that the dollars can follow them wherever it is that their parents believes it needs to go.
Thank you. Luke.
Yeah, I would just maybe expand on this and think about student-centered funding. There's multiple things to it, including what goes into the decision around how much each student is funded. I love Tim's point around, different students probably need different amounts. I think that's absolutely true. But I also think that we need to think, again, I'm going to keep harping on this, think broader about how that money can be spent. Right? The idea that a child's education and development is confined to the walls of a school building is just, we all know, not true. I think we can all probably think about our examples in our own personal lives around sort of supplemental extra things that we went on a summer camp or some sort of extra experience, or maybe tutoring when we fell behind. I know one of my friends has a special needs child and had a speech delay, and the school was doing everything they could, and the school was putting more money in. He had an IEP. He was a lawyer. He's a lawyer, so he knew how to sort of milk that system for the maximum amount that he could get out of it. But it just simply wasn't enough. But I saw this kid. They finally said, you know what? We're going to do this. It's a yes and. We're going to let the school process work, but we're going to get a private speech pathologist to come to the house every Saturday and Sunday for a couple weeks. And I watched this child just transform. His ability to speak and communicate not only changed the basics around language, but it changed this entire child's demeanor and the way they sort of interacted with the world. And so my point being there is, like, student-centered funding really matters in terms of how we invest that money. I totally agree with Tim's point. I think, Ellen, you're hitting on that as well. But I also think that we need to realize that maximizing the flexibility on how it can be spent, and I know everybody on this panel agrees with that, is just as an important aspect as making sure the funding formulas on the input side are equitable and fair.
Thanks to all of you. I have another question, and before I go to that question, Timothy, thank you for your question. That was addressed to Luke. He actually identified, before I saw your question, some of the things he's doing to build a coalition to support his ESA-like program. So thanks for that. Here's a question. Choice programs are still pretty limited in terms of the number of students served. What one thing needs to change to scale school choice options? Tim, we'll start with you.
Boy, what one thing?
One thing.
I think we really need to think about universal eligibility for these programs. So many of the programs that have been passed are targeted towards unique small populations of students. We really need to be thinking about every single student. There are so many needs across income levels, across communities. I think we need to start thinking about universal eligibility.
And as you know, within the school choice family, that has been a big debate for 2 decades now, universal versus means tested. So we will continue that.
Well, and we're there to defend any type of program at IJ, but I think that one switch could do a lot.
What about you, Luke?
Yeah, I think that's a great debate, Tim. I think that's a fun one. But I guess this is back to my sort of Hayekian view of the world. I don't think there is one solution, so I'll take a cop-out answer. I mean, in Colorado, you're hearing what I think what we need to do to move the ball forward in Colorado. And I think that sort of broadened our definitions. In other states, though, I think the answer is different. Candidly, I think that often, especially in some red states, there's a political solution that's waiting out there that hasn't been tapped into, which is sort of playing hardball on a single issue from a partisan perspective. So I guess I would say different states have different answers. Some are political, some are policy, some are a mix of both. But I would say each state has its own unique dynamics. You heard me say in Colorado, but in a state like Oklahoma, supermajority, Republicans in both chambers, but yet still resistance. I think it's a slightly different problem that could be solved in maybe a little more politically hardball sort of way.
Got it. Ellen.
I go back to parents. I think that equipping parents with information about different ways that they can help see their child served is really transformational. Back to what you said, Gerard, nothing makes me angrier than the condescension that is displayed when people say parents aren't equipped to make a choice for their child. One of the most incredible, I think, movies I have ever seen is Miss Virginia. Everybody wrote Miss Virginia off because she was a single mom who was just hustling, emptying trash cans to try to get her son the education that he needed. And I think that the voice of parents is the one thing that is going to ultimately push this beyond the very limited programs that we've seen to date. I'm with Tim. I mean, let's go towards universal, but I think one more step on that path is expanding these programs to hit more middle income families. I mean, we know that if you're making $75,000 a year in America today and you have 2 kids at home, I mean, you're not living high on the hog. Like, let's be real here. It's not just low income people that need help. Middle income people need and deserve our help as well.
Thank you. Well, as you know, all great things must come to an end. We're a few minutes away from the time that we have been allotted. So with that, if you can, within a minute and a half, just give us some closing thoughts on what you think we as the audience should think about in terms of next steps as we move into 2021. And Luke, I'll start off with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you're not thinking about how we respond to the pandemic, not just getting back to normal as soon as possible, but how we're going to do more to catch up. And I think there's obviously a clear connection between school choice and that question. But I would just urge all education advocates, regardless of whether you're a choice advocate or not, we can't just get back to normal and say, all right, we're going to keep going again. If we're not doing something extra to get back to what was lost, then I think we're failing our kids. So it's just a challenge, I think, to all education advocates to think about what we're going to do above and beyond the normal.
Thank you. Tim.
Yeah, well, I'm gonna steal a little bit of Luke's talks, which is that as we're thinking about how to address all of the inequities and other things that have been revealed, the shortcomings in the public education system that have been revealed as a result of this pandemic, we need to be thinking about giving parents very flexible options. We've talked a lot about school choice generally, but I think in a way, we need to be talking about educational choice. I love education savings accounts because they do so much of what Luke talks about. It gives families the dollars that would have been spent on their child in a public school, and it allows them to use it in a wide variety for educational options and choices. They don't have to use it to attend a private school. They can use it for tutoring. They can use it to get those sort of special needs services that Luke was describing for his friend's child, and they can really truly tailor their child's educational program to meet their unique needs. We need to think about flexibility and giving parents options beyond the traditional schoolhouse, the traditional school, private schools, public schools. We need to think about education more broadly.
Thank you. Ellen.
I'm going to continue the tradition and piggyback off of Tim. ESAs, we're going for it here in South Carolina. I want to say a public thank you to Tim and the great folks at the Goldwater Institute who really pioneered this model in Arizona. South Carolina's legal situation after Safe Grants is very analogous to what Arizona went through in their voucher and then ESA fight. So you all have laid out the roadmap for us, and we're going to keep trudging along on the journey. We won't stop fighting, and I hope everybody on this call will be encouraged to stay in the game.
Tim, thank you so much for keeping us abreast of what's taking place at the federal court level, Supreme Court, but also at the appellate district level, but also at the state level, and for all the great work you've done over the years. I know you're transitioning into another position, but not transitioning out of helping some of our most vulnerable populations. So thank you for your work. Luke, thank you so much for the work you do in trying to make sure both parties or multiple parties are at the table, that it's just not one lane, but that we can truly try to find some common ground across and beyond partisan lines, particularly in a place where people have different type of options. Ellen, thank you so much for your leadership as it relates to public policy, using your think tank for what it is, a think tank to help people think broadly about the role of families. Many of those families are led by moms, some by grandparents, but by an adult caregiver who simply says, I want more options for my family. And while we focus primarily on private school choice, let us remember that public schools have had choice programs in place long before vouchers, tax credits, ESAs. We have magnet schools in the public school sector. We have academies in the public school sector. We even allow students to cross district lines with public money to do so. So all we're saying is this a conversation about public education or about an education that's in the public's good? And if we're looking at education in the public's good and for a public purpose, private school choice has a role to play in it. With that, I want to thank all of you for joining us. Thank my three panelists again for your great contribution. And we look forward to 2021 and what that will bring for school choice across the country. Thank you.